The first thing that I'm going to mention about the strong arm is when I spoke with Marc Geiger, who is the genius behind the engineering of this, who developed this. The first thing that he wanted to mention is that if you're using new clay, it does not need to be wedged, but it would be a good idea if you can make it round. So if you happen to have an inability to wedge, this is going to be kind of a helpful step for you. And actually, I also tell my students this: if you have new clay and you're throwing without a strong arm, I usually just tell them just give it a couple turns to help round it a little bit and help to make it uniform. But in the case of this, I just rounded it a little bit just by tapping it as opposed to wedging it. So that's the first big takeaway. Now, when centering this is my very first time. We're going to see how this goes. Now, you may be able to see that on the bat, I actually did put some concentric circles. Those will help you to kind of get your clay a little bit more in the center. And then one of my tips that I have always told kids is if you can actually just seal it to the bat. I think that sealing it to the bat often helps. Now, as you do this, you can kind of gauge it and try to make sure that that's looking fairly centered along with your lines there. Okay. Now, when you are starting the centering process with the strong arm, Marc recommends you start at kind of a slowish speed. You just take enough water to add a little bit of moisture with your sponge one time, and then you bring that strong arm in. Now, this has a little bit of play to the arm, which is totally normal. The key thing to remember is you are just pulling this inward instead of downward. So as I push this inward, okay, with the paddle, I can also take my left hand and just kind of hook my thumb over the top. So as I am bringing this in, it's just skimming right above the bat. I'm pushing my hands together just like I would when centering anything. So I'm going to go ahead and speed my wheel up just a smidge. And one of the things Marc wanted me to emphasize is you don't want to be hunched over your wheel, okay? You're standing up at this point. When you're standing up nice and straight, it helps you to have a little bit more control. Oh, and the other thing that he talked about was look at the arm as opposed to looking at the clay. We're so used to looking at the clay, but if you look at the arm and you can see that the arm is no longer wobbly, then you know that you're centered. Okay, now the top, I was able to kind of keep the top flat there just with my left thumb. And before I go to the next step, this is recommended. So as I take my left thumb, I can kind of push it down in there and make a slight well, or as Marc describes it, a slight volcano. That gives you an indent. Now I can pull that out, and then I can bring this one in. Now before I go do the next step, I'm going to add a little bit of water here. Okay, now as you do this, even though this was centered, you can see that up here it's coming at it from a little bit more from the outside. Well, remember, this is a lever, so as I push this down in there, it's eventually going to the center. Now I might want a little bit more water on there because I do have a little bit of a hunk of clay that peeled off. Okay, and I'm keeping my left thumb on the top, and as I push this down in there, okay, I go down to the preset depth that I had, and then I'm going to push it open just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to add just a little bit more water to this. So once I can clean this guy off. And then as I pull this open, I can now pull it open to my desired width on the interior, keeping my left hand there on the side. And now I have a beautifully centered hunk of clay that's ready for pulling. And I'm just going to pull that up as normal. Now, why would I want to use the strong arm? Maybe I just want to be a production potter and I want to be faster. Maybe I have some physical ailment that's making it more difficult, like a wrist injury, a shoulder injury. Maybe I'm just weaker than I used to be 30 years ago, right? A strong arm can be for anyone, but you still need to know all the principles behind the pulling and the centering. Okay. 3 5/8. All right, so now I'm going to do my second go of this. Now I have a bat where I cut and then removed the piece, so I still have the clay there. So just like using the concentric circles, I can take this clay, try to land it right in the middle of that. And again, I will recommend just sealing it to the bat, no water, sealing it to the bat. That helps to get it really anchored on there. Okay, now I am going to use enough water just to coat it, enough from my sponge. I'm going to bring in the paddle. Now notice the clay that's on there is all nice and wet. I do not have dried up clay on there. That would be nasty and it would really present some issues. So as I bring this in, just like centering anything, it's bringing the off-centered clay bits to the top. So as I do that, I can take my left hand on the side and I just wrap my left thumb over the top. So that helps to keep it rounded there on the top, and it helps to keep it from going a lot taller. So there's no reason to cone it up with this strong arm. Now, because it hovers just a little bit above the bat, it doesn't go all the way down to the very, very bottom, but I could always just take my fingernail and take that stuff off, right? So the key thing is, just like with centering conventionally, you want to get the clay centered down where the clay meets the bat. So the key is, with the strong arm, you're just pushing it in. You're not pushing it down. We're just pushing it in, okay? And you want to watch the wood arm as you do this, because as soon as it stops like bumping around, then you know that you're centered, okay? Now, before I move on to dropping the middle, I'm going to do the next step, which is I'm going to create a slight bit of a well here with my, I just take my left thumb, wrapping it over the top. By creating a well, that gives me an indent where the middle part, I'm not too sure what you call it. Can we call it a plunger? I don't know what we're going to call that, where we plunge the hole in the middle. Now, before I add that, I'm going to add a little bit more water, because as I do this, okay, so you can see that the if I can call it, again, I'll call it the plunger. As I put this in from the side, okay, you can see it's not dead center. Well, the reason it's not dead center right now is because it has to go down. So as I do this, I'm going to keep my left thumb on the top and I push this in. Now, if I have a little bit of accumulated clay on there, I can take that off. Okay, I'm going to add just a wee bit more water. Okay, but again, my left thumb I have wrapped up over the edge. Okay, and then I go down until I'm at the bottom, and then once again I have like a little chunk of clay there that peeled off. Now I'm going to open this up, and I'm opening it toward my left hand. And I open it as far as I need it to go. So this is now opened. So the plunger on the inside creates a nice smooth interior, basically like you've used a rib. So now I can go ahead and pull just like I would normally. I do this over on the right hand side because I like to have the clay spinning away, since I'm going counterclockwise. As I pull, I'm pulling on the right hand side, so this clay is spinning between my fingers and away from me. Now, I'm going to lift this off, and there's a little trick that I can do. If I want to lift it off and it's still a little thin or soft, I can zap it with a heat gun or a hair dryer. It looks off center because I have already cut it and it moved. Alrighty, so now I'm going to take, actually I'll set this over here so you can see it. So I'm going to take my dry, clean hands, going to spread my fingers apart, lift, and then I can set it on my board. Now, I could have left it on my bat, but if I wanted to still use that same one with the little rings, I just figured I would take it off. The principles of throwing with this tool, it's exactly the same as throwing just with your hands. There are many things that you still need to be aware of. It's not a magic tool for people that don't understand throwing. It's just a tool to make it a little easier in that centering part. So you always want to start with your clay fairly centered, right? Okay. If you have the ability to kind of tap it into a mountain before you add water, I recommend that. Now, you also want to think about how wide your piece is going to be. If I'm just throwing a cylinder, I'm going to keep it about this width. If I'm going to make a wide bowl, I'm going to center it to a much wider piece. So you have to think about what is the form going to be, and that will help you determine how big your centered piece needs to be. Now, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of water from my sponge on there. I'm going to switch these out. Again, this has some slip on there from the previous times. I would not do this with dried clay. So as I bring this in, I'm just pushing inward toward the middle. I'm not pushing downward. And then to get the top flat, I'm going to add a little water. And then I just rest my hand on there. And I take that left thumb and I'm hooking that left thumb over the top. So the left hand is doing very similar to what it normally does. It's keeping it flat on the top, or at least rounded in my case. Okay. Now, if I need it to be a little bit lower, then I can push down a little bit more as I'm using that tool to center. Again, the arm, I'm just bringing it inward. I'm not pushing downward on it. Or if I did push downward, I stopped pushing downward because you could hear it scraping. All right, so now this is looking pretty good. Again, it doesn't go all the way against the bat, so I could just take the back side of my thumb and just shave off a little bit of that if it's flaring out like a mountain. Now, in order to ready this for the little plunger arm that comes in, I am going to take my left thumb and I'm going to make a slight indent like a little volcano. Okay. And then again, some more water. Now, when I go to bring this plunger up and around, remember that eventually it's going to be in the center, but because this is a lever, it starts from outward before it swings down. So you can see it's not dead center to begin with. So as I do this, you might want to hold it with two hands. There we go. And I'm even going to take my left hand over the top. So you can use two hands to be a little bit more stable if you would like. So a little bit more water. So as I push this down in. Okay, now it's going toward the middle, and when it gets to my preset depth, it stops. Okay, now I'm just going to take that out, take off some of that clay. So just like when I am throwing something normally, it has a hole that's shaped like that. Okay, so as I do this with my left hand on the top, I can now open this. So I'm going to take the arm and I push it toward my left hand. Left thumb is hooked over the top again. And I open it to the width that I need my form to be. So in the case of this, I'm making a cylinder. So I wanted to think about the interior of the cylinder. I'm making some steins. Now I'm just going to steady that wall. And at this point, I'm really done with the tool and I'm just finishing the form as normal.